So I've never engaged with a chatbot ever.
This is me, back in April 2024.
I have no idea. I don't even know where you go online. I don't know anything. I would probably, if it was up to me, I'd probably Google ChatGPT.
I read a lot about it. I don't actually use it, so
Yeah.
I'm in the same boat.
I'm at the Jackman Humanities Institute at the University of Toronto with Teresa Heffernan, a former visiting faculty research fellow. And I'm about to engage with ChatGPT for the very first time.
It says here, ChatGPT can make mistakes. Consider checking important information. Read our terms and privacy policy. So write me a brief description of a podcast featuring humanities and literature scholars discussing the perils of AI. Oh my gosh, it's going so fast. Oh my God. It mentions there's Frankenstein. It's very creepy.
I don't know, there's just always been something about chatbots and artificial intelligence and big tech that doesn't sit right with me. I just don't trust it. It wasn't until I got the chance to speak with Teresa, who's been researching AI and robotics for more than 20 years, that I started to understand what's really going on.
Well, it's also interesting that if you look at that, we uncover narratives that reflect our hopes, fears, and uncertainties about AI. But that's where I'd say, let's back up there.
Teresa Heffernan is a professor of English language and literature at St. Mary's University in Halifax. While at the JHI, she was investigating how literal readings of science fiction are shaping the AI industry and our society. It's a fascination that began in the early 2000s.
I kept seeing references to fiction as evidence, and I was thinking, okay, well, there's something wrong there, and I wanted to go and figure out what that relationship between the science and the fiction, what that relationship was. And I also wanted to go and see, okay, well, what's your model of human? What does that mean? What do you mean by intelligence? So I did go off to Japan. I went through the States. I talked to people like Geoffrey Hinton. And I didn't get very good answers, I would say.
The absence of intelligence in AI is the focus of Teresa Heffernan's research. It's also the focus of this very first episode of Humanities at Large, a new podcast from the Jackman Humanities Institute at the University of Toronto. Each year, the JHI invites a group of research fellows from various disciplines to investigate topics based on a theme. Last year's theme was absence. I'm your host, Melissa Gismondi. I was a JHI fellow back in 2020. Over 6 episodes every other week, I'll introduce you to a different research fellow and their inquiries about absence through the lens of philosophy, music, landscape architecture, social justice, and more. We're starting this series with Teresa Heffernan and the absence of intelligence, the science and fiction of AI. This conversation was recorded back in April. Since then, news about artificial intelligence has been constant.
OpenAI just dropped a bombshell.
GPT-4o.
The laughing, chatting, singing AI, so responsive, says The Guardian, you could almost forget it's not a sentient being.
The latest version passes the bar exam.
The thing we should embrace and be terrified of.
Elon Musk is suing OpenAI for breach of contract. He has warned before that the unfettered use of generative artificial intelligence could pose an existential threat.
Geoffrey, thanks so much for joining us. You've spoken out saying that AI could manipulate or possibly figure out a way to kill humans. How do we solve this problem?
One of the problems with the reporting on AI is that these companies put out what are basically press releases or product information, and it gets picked up in a way sort of like, a corporation getting a free platform to advertise their products. We're sort of prone to be seduced by these narratives because of the the framing of a lot of intentional framing of a lot of this technology by fiction. And so you get seduced by this story, so for the last year, they've been talking about AI as an existential risk, and it's a real distraction from what is actually happening.
This is sort of difficult to wrap your brain around because it's like, why would developers want us to think that AI poses an existential threat when AI is their product?
I would say that there are some true believers that think that actually AI is an existential risk. And if you go back, you can go back to Alan Turing, who's considered one of the fathers of AI. And you can go back to his papers in 1950. And he talks about this child machine that he is creating and the possibilities that machines will take over. And then he says, like in Erewhon. Erewhon is a Victorian novel. It's 1872. It's written by Samuel Butler. It's a satire. What Butler refers to is this kind of specious analogy. So specious analogy means that, it has a kind of ring of truth, but it's completely fallacious. It's in the story, there's a section called the Book of Machines. And what Butler does is apply Darwinian logic to machines. And so this whole society is completely afraid. Remember, this is 1872, completely afraid that machines will take over. When Turing reads that in 1950, he was known as a sort of literal reader. He takes that seriously. You've seen now iterations of that. You can kind of trace it from that moment, but you can see iterations of that idea of machines taking over or AI becoming autonomous, the possibility of becoming a super intelligence. You've seen iterations of that from the 1950s on, from Turing's paper on. But when you actually go, okay, tell me what the science is, tell me what the logic behind this is. There isn't any. Often what I get instead is like, well, it's like Terminator. Well, it's like, those are fictions. And we can talk about how to interpret fictions, but, they're not science. They can't fill in for scientific evidence. So why is this? Well, it's a huge distraction from what is actually going on with AI, which is massive amounts of power. Water is very environmentally resource intensive. Not to mention the kind of destruction to democracy, the kind of toxic bots out there, the troll farms, all sorts of things. But this idea of AI as being a kind of threat that is possibly developing is a big distraction, and it puts it off into the future as opposed to what should be regulated right now. So it also keeps the prophets of AI in complete power in a sense, because they're the ones who are determining what regulations we need. They keep saying, we'll keep it safe.
I know you've talked about how when you get down to it, AI is just sort of it's data, it's cameras, it's microphones, it's algorithms. It's not that sexy. It's not that innovative in a way. So is that part of this too, of that if you exaggerate the risks, it makes the innovation look maybe more significant or more daring than it actually is?
Yeah, I think there's a kind of glamour to it. There's a sort of intensity to it. There's the threat of it, all these things, and we just think, oh, please keep us safe, Microsoft,
Right. Please keep us safe, Sam Altman.
Exactly.
Yes.
Who I would mention is a prepper himself. So I don't know if people know the term prepper, but it's people who kind of stockpile, he's got stockpiles of gas masks and antibiotics and all sorts of things, for this point when the world goes into chaos.
Do you know, not to take us down the prepper, right. I am just curious, in this sort of tech elite logic, because I know there's others. I think Peter Thiel.
Absolutely.
I know Mark Zuckerberg's building some compound in Hawaii, I think.
These bunkers.
These bunkers, yeah. Yes. Like, are they talking about climate now, or are they talking about technology gone rogue in terms of the future that they're afraid of that you have to prep for?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. Like, is it nuclear weapons? Is it AI? Is it climate change? I think the other thing that they're really concerned about is the massive concentration of wealth and power that they have.
So they're afraid of us in a way.
Well, I think they're looking around and thinking, I think they are afraid of us. But I think that it's also like, they're looking around, and it's sort of an apocalyptic narrative. It's like the apocalypse will happen and then we'll be able to kind of restore the world, whether that's on Mars or whether it's on Earth or, another planet. A lot of them are so influenced by science fiction. And I think that, there is this tendency amongst that crowd to have a kind of literal reading of science fiction. If you look at, for instance, someone like Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk, I mean, they talk about growing up on Star Trek, and Jeff Bezos actually models himself on Captain Picard. I mean, he's got his dog named after one of the characters. He wrote himself into a show. He's got the bald head, all these things. So Captain Picard is a huge hero.
Graves, give Data back. Give him back. He's not simply an android. He's a life form, entirely unique.
When they're talking about it, they say like, well, I watch Star Trek and I'm frustrated with the state of intergalactical travel. And you're like, wow, but hold on. That was actually like fiction, and if you read anything by Gene Roddenberry, who's the creator of Star Trek, he said, I was talking about the Vietnam War, I was talking about race politics in the States, I was talking about patriarchy, and I couldn't get it by the censors. But if I put it back, on this planet with purple-haired people, I could get away with a lot. And so, you've got the first white-black kiss on TV in Star Trek.
Mm-hmm. So they're missing, which I think you have this quote on your website from Ursula K. Le Guin, science fiction is not predictive, it is descriptive. That's what they're essentially missing in these literal readings of science fiction.
Yeah, that they treat it as a kind of prophetic. And I think that there's a way in which fiction is never predictive. What it is a kind of defamiliarizing our present so that we can see more clearly the problems that we're having in the present. So, for instance, if you take Terminator, James Cameron says, I was never talking about like killer robots. I was talking about the whole military industrial complex, and that is actually dehumanizing us, not that we're going to create machines that are killing people.
Mm-hmm. So this idea that super intelligent machines are one day going to overthrow us or kill us, whether it's the Terminator or HAL in 2001, A Space Odyssey, try to kill us. Is this at all possible, or are we just so far away from that future that AI is sort of trying to make us afraid of?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people would say, well, it's not here yet. AGI, which is artificial general intelligence, is not here yet, but it's coming. And I'm like, well, okay, show me the model, because I don't see it. And if you go back to Turing again, which I think his model is still very much there, what happens is the idea of imitation. So what the Turing test is all about, if I can't tell the difference between a computer and a human, then I must be able to say that the computer has reached human-like intelligence. But if you think about it for a minute, or if you read Turing, the article is called "Can a Machine Think?" But he very quickly says, well, thinking, is too complicated, so I'm going to look at imitation. And imitation and thinking have nothing to do with each other. I can get up on a stage and I can say, I'm a pilot, or I can be in a film and I can play a pilot. But that doesn't mean I know how to fly a plane. I actually know nothing about it. I'm pretending, it's pretense, right? And the Turing test actually starts out as the imitation game. And it's between a man and a woman, with a judge there, and the judge can't see the man or the woman, and the woman is trying to prove that she's a woman, and the man is trying to prove that he's the woman. And so it is based on deception. The man can lie, all sorts of things, which is all fine within the parameters of a game. But when you put that out into kind of like the world at large, you know, we can go from Turing right to deep fakes. You know, it's the same model. So as I say, within the parameters of a game, or within fiction, or within film, or within plays, pretense is great. Mimicry is great, but not when you put it out to the world and you pretend that it's true.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. As you were starting to sort of research the subject and get into it, you took some trips and you went to talk to people like Geoffrey Hinton, who's considered, you know, one of the godfathers of AI, and you went to Japan. Talk a little bit about that trip and maybe what you learned that sort of got you to see AI differently. Because for me, I sometimes think, okay, if I went to talk to these guys, I'd probably, you know, buy everything that they're saying. But you have come away with a very different, critical view of AI.
In Japan, for the robotics lab that I was at, he's probably the biggest roboticist in the world, Ishiguro. He creates what's called Geminoids. So the Geminoids look like their maker. So he has several of them. And I also went to Denmark to meet the only Caucasian Geminoid. And, you know, I think when I first encountered the Geminoids, they are kind of startling because they're life size. The Danish Geminoid, it's Henrik Scharf's Geminoid, but it's very, you know, it has its own tailor, so it's incredibly well dressed. You know, there's the kind of initial like surprise, and you know, you're impressed. But after a while, it just seems like a hunk of silicone sitting there on a breathing pump in the corner. What happens with a lot of the kind of videos of humanoid type robots is that they're really well edited. Nothing's breaking down. They're kind of seamless. You know, it's expensive shooting for these videos, and people are really impressed. But when you hang out with these robots for any length of time, they're breaking down. Pepper, for instance, which is one of the robots I met in Japan, you know, like you go, it's broken. It can't do anything. They're just really expensive dolls.
Right. Well, I want to get in a little bit more to this literal readings of fiction. And I'm curious if you sort of remember the first time you read or saw a fictional story about AI taking over. So I rewatched 2001 on A Space Odyssey on the weekend, and I was struck by, you know, for a movie in 1968,
right,
HAL is terrifying.
Oh, HAL, do you read me?
Especially, you know, the scene where Dave's trying to get him to open the pod doors so he can come back in.
Open the pod bay doors, HAL.
I'm sorry, Dave. I'm afraid I can't do that.
I sort of felt the challenges of Dave's dependency, in this case on potentially on his life, on HAL, on technology. And it resonated a little bit with me as I was thinking about how dependent we are on technology right now.
Dave, this conversation can serve no purpose anymore. Goodbye.
HAL?
So I'm curious for you if you can remember the first sort of time you engaged with a story about AI taking over.
I guess you could go back to Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, actually. When you think of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, I'm always curious at the point when the monster comes to life.
Oh, it's alive! It's alive! It's alive! It's alive!
And he runs from his lab screaming, and you think, well, okay, but what did you know, what were you expecting? Right. And then he spends the rest of the novel trying to kill off the monster. But if you go back to the kind of reason he created the monster in the first place, it's because his mother had died, and he was so grief-stricken. And I think grief underlies so much of this fascination with artificial intelligence and with kind of creating life. He's so grief-stricken that he decides, you know, I need to kind of be able to bring people back to life because death is this horrible thing.
Now I know what it feels like to be God.
But then he rebels against it because he sees that as not, in fact, human.
You know, you were talking earlier about Alan Turing and his imitation game, or the Turing test. Talk a little bit more about these sort of different views of intelligence, human intelligence, and how it's applied to AI. So I'm thinking about in terms of maybe how you might approach the question of what is intelligence from the point of art, from the point of humanities, versus the view of intelligence that Turing, how he saw it when he was working out some of his ideas in Can Machines Think?
Yeah, I mean, you know, if you think about computers, the way that you turn, you know, the world into information is by turning it into code, and it's binary, right? It works on a 1-0. So it's a kind of yes-no logic to it. That's not how humans work. That's not how intelligence works. And it's certainly not how literature works. But you see right away there's the assumption that the computer works like a brain. Well, we know so little about the brain. How do you even begin with that assumption? You know, like some of the neurologists that I've read just say, you know, well, we might know 5% about how the brain actually works. How are you assuming your computer works like that? You know, how do you make that analogy? And that's what I say. It's this problem where you use a metaphor, and that metaphor becomes sort of a literalized. And they're two different things. Some things you want to have a kind of yes-no answer to. But a lot of the world is a lot more complicated than that. And humans, the way that they think is a lot more complicated than that. So you get this kind of reductionist logic. And when you put that reductionist logic out in the world, it really shuts down conversations about all sorts of things. So when people think, oh, I'm getting a response from, for instance, one of the chatbots, that's already a really limited response. You know, the way that the chatbots work is that you have this large database, and then it's working with kind of the statistical predictability. So how often has this word appeared next to this word, this sentence in this, you know, in this context or in this paragraph? So all this is kind of like imposing a certain restrictive version of what intelligence is. And I think we need a much more kind of creative approach to the problems that we have in the world.
That we're dealing with right now, not in this future that AI is sort of warning us about.
Yeah, and sorry, and I'll go back to your question because you talked about, will we get to AGI? And as I say, I don't see any model for it. You know, I've been looking at this field for a long time. I find that there's like massive amounts of projects that I can tell you right away won't work. And I'll give you one example. It was at Georgia Tech, funded by the military. It was on the front cover, I think, of Time magazine. It was a robot sitting on a humanoid robot sitting on a stack of books, and it was like Nietzsche and Marcus Aurelius and philosophy and novels sitting on the stack of books. And it said, you know, we're making ethical robots. And I'm like, okay, how do you make an ethical robot? Because to me, ethics requires a lot of kind of complicated thinking. You know, I'm looking at the model, and their model is we're going to get the machines to read literature, and then they'll know how to act in the world because they'll know how humans act. And I'm just like, what could you possibly mean by reading there? You know, when you think like what you're doing is pattern matching. There's no understanding, there's no imagination, there's no ethical imagination possible in that scenario. But, you know, there's huge amounts of money that goes into this. Of course, we've got nowhere with the idea of ethical machines, but it has received a lot of funding.
And I read in something you wrote that it was John McCarthy who originally coined the term AI that later came to regret it and said computational intelligence would have been a better term for what this is. So
exactly. So John McCarthy says, you know, like he regretted it at the end of life. He said, I wish I had never use this term. I wish I had used computational intelligence, which I think makes a lot more sense. It's, it is a process of computing.
Mm-hmm. And when you say that they're trained on data sets, these are like trillions and trillions and trillions of data sets. I think we're recording this in April. I heard yesterday that they think they might run out of human-based data to feed AI by 2026.
Yes.
So this is a lot of data, right? It's not like a small amount.
Massive.
Yeah.
Massive. And I mean, in that data, one of the things that has to be done is it all has to be cleaned up, so that your chat GPT doesn't send you all sorts of violent or pornographic rape images, whatever, Mm-hmm. So all that data has to be sorted, and all that data is being done by very poorly paid workers in various parts of the world, like
mm-hmm.
Kenya.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really traumatic work.
Should we ask it the carbon footprint of that question? What was the carbon footprint of your response? Interesting. As an AI language model, I don't have direct access to real-time data about energy consumption or carbon footprint. However, the energy consumption associated with generating this response would be minimal. These servers are maintained and optimized by OpenAI to be energy efficient.
Spin response of the industry.
Yes, this is like a corporate statement. Yes. For sure.
Just for some quick stats, a typical data center will require about 3 to 5 million gallons of water. Very often these are in the desert where there's not a lot of water, to say nothing of the minerals and the stuff that has to be mined for, all of the electronic components that creates e-waste. And at the same time, within this media hype, AI is sort of pushing this narrative that AI is inevitable and it's going to be everywhere. Absolutely. And we want it to be everywhere. So I'm curious your thoughts on what the implications of this narrative is, particularly at a time when we're really starting to see the stark reality of the climate crisis, because these are all, as I understand it, they're very much connected.
Absolutely. And I think that, first of all, you have to look at, okay, where does that narrative come from? Because you can look at the many winters that the AI industry has undergone. So the winters are like, okay, we thought it could do this, it can't do this. And then the whole thing gets shelved and people stop investing in it. But then there's the new hype cycle. So right now it's like, AI is going to cure all these diseases and it's going to give us solutions to climate change. And I just want to say how, please tell me how. Don't just make the promise. Tell me how this is actually going to work. And then when you look at the AI industry, it is hugely resource intensive. And so at the same time that we're trying to cut back on our carbon footprint, we're investing in a whole industry that is increasing this carbon footprint. And I think I read recently, but is a physicist who, when you look at the kind of explosion of data that's happening mostly through social media, that in a certain amount of time, it will require as much power. The digital world will require as much power as our entire world is using right now. So you can see that it's completely, unsustainable. It's unsustainable. And even people like Sam Altman will admit that and say, we actually need another power source. Well, we don't have the other power source. So, so we better start paying attention to the kind of infrastructure that we're creating. But I would also say, a lot of the people who are in the tech, have been in the AI industry, are what I would refer to as techno-utopians. Mm. So they have this great faith in the idea that technology will save us.
Including from the climate crisis.
Including from the climate. Or, we're going to go off and live on other planets or move into outer space. It's a very, very particular narrative. And I think what we actually need to do is take care of this planet.
I'm curious if you think the hype has started to maybe wane. So, right now, OpenAI, several, I think, companies are being sued by artists, musicians, the New York Times. Are we maybe going back to a period where this hype around AI gets quieter, maybe even goes away, or maybe even we see AI differently?
Yeah, I mean, when I teach my students, they're very quick. When I explain the environmental costs of it, they're like, oh, yeah, okay, that makes sense. I think they have a better understanding of the technology. They have a better understanding of how it's impacted their lives. So I think there is a kind of resistance to a lot of the narratives that have been so dominant in the media, but as I say, largely put out by a fairly small group of men, powerful men, but powerful.
Right. We spent a lot of time today talking about how AI has misunderstood fiction. And so I'm curious what role you think fiction can play in helping us start to overcome some of the challenges that we're facing because of AI, whether it's fiction helping us imagine different futures or demanding different futures. But where do you see the role of fiction?
Fiction says, look, I'm fiction. I'm making this stuff up. I'm making up talking lions or robots or whatever. And so it announces itself as fiction and then says, okay, so let's look at how narrative works. Let's have some kind of reflexivity. And I think that's why, for instance, I wasn't seduced early on by the kind of narratives about humanoid, soon to be human intelligence, machine intelligence, because I wanted to say, how does that work? And you never get a simple answer, right? In literature, you'll never get a simple answer. I also think that there's some really interesting writers at the moment who are sort of fighting back against the co-option of fiction by the AI industry, because with the AI industry, fiction turns into kind of tech propaganda, So they're sort of reclaiming fiction as fiction. And there's a great novel by Will Eaves called Murmur, and it's about Alan Turing. He uses an avatar. But it's a kind of really interesting novel which looks at where Alan Turing is thinking of the brain mechanically. And then because Alan Turing, of course, was forced to go through a kind of chemical castration, and his body started to change, and he was under this kind of regime, this authority, and he started to rebel against it, or Eaves in any case thinks that he would have rebelled against it. Turing ends up committing suicide not long after that. And there's a sense in which there's a reclaiming of okay, what are the implications of thinking of the brain as mechanical? What happens to my body then? What happens to a body? What's the connection between the brain and the body, or an embodied or an environment?
So it sounds like this is humanizing it, putting the human back into this subject that has been stripped of it, essentially. It's
yeah, I mean, when I say I don't want to, because I always think of the human as something, that is open. We don't have a clear definition of what it means to be human. So I would say it's more resisting a very reductive notion of what intelligence is or what creativity is. So it's not so much the human versus the machine, but rather recognizing the kind of very limited ways that machines operate.
Teresa Heffernan is a professor of English language and literature at St. Mary's University. She was the Visiting Public Humanities Faculty Fellow at the JHI from 2023 to 2024. Thanks for listening to this very first episode of Humanities at Large from the Jackman Humanities Institute at the University of Toronto. If you enjoyed this conversation, be sure to subscribe, share this episode, and leave us a 5-star review. It really helps to get the word out. I'm Melissa Gismondi, and I'll be back in 2 weeks.